Hi, everybody. Today we're going to read the last chapter of our book, Helen Keller. I hope you've enjoyed this book as much as I have. I've enjoyed reading it too, and I hope that you will love reading books in the future because reading is fun. It opens up lots of opportunities and new worlds that we cannot always go to, but we can travel through the book. So today it's called The Busy Years. Helen was very lucky, and she knew it. My life is so rich in two things, she said, friends and books. But what about the other deaf and blind people who were not so lucky? Helen knew that many led lonely lives with no family and few friends. Often they were too poor to go to school. Too often the blind never learned how to read with their hands. Too often the deaf were not taught to speak with their mouths. Their days were long and dull. And life is made up of days, Helen Keller said. Helen was 24 years old now. She had many more years to live, and she was determined to do something useful with those years. She decided to become a writer. She would write about the problems of the blind and the deaf. But soon Helen found that only people wanted her to write only about herself. They were not interested in how to save a baby's eyes from blindness or in a new kind of school for the deaf. Helen kept on writing, but now she thought of another way to help. She decided to give lectures. She and teacher would travel from town to town all across the country, giving speeches about the problems of the blind and the deaf. First, teacher came on stage and spoke about their early years together. Then Helen, in her blurred voice, told the audience that what it was like to be deaf and blind. About the deaf, Helen Keller said, they are surrounded by silence, never to be broken by a word or a song or the sigh of a breeze. About the blind, who Helen felt were the loneliest people in the world, she said, they stare into the dark, and nothing but the dark stares back. Helen also gave advice. I, who am blind, can only give one hint to you who can see. Use your eyes as if tomorrow you would go blind. So let's think about that. Use your eyes as if tomorrow you would go blind. Do the same with all your other senses. Hear the song of a bird as if tomorrow you would go deaf. Touch everything as if tomorrow you would never be able to touch anything again. Smell the flowers, taste every bit of food as if tomorrow you would never taste or smell again. Finally, Helen answered questions from the audiences. Some of the questions people asked were serious ones. Others were just plain silly. Can you tell the difference between colors? She was asked again and again. Sometimes I feel blue and sometimes I see red, Helen would always answer. Do you sleep with your eyes open? I never stayed awake to see. The busy years were passing and Helen Keller's teacher was growing old. One day she said to Helen, I'm sorry, dear, but I can't make any more trips with you. Then teacher fell sick and had to spend most of her time in bed. You must get well, a friend begged. Helen would be nothing without you. Teacher frowned. Then I would have failed, she answered. She had worked all her life to make Helen Keller free even of her. Annie Sullivan died on October 19, 1936. Helen had faced other pain in her life, but nothing like this. Her thoughts flew back over 50 years to the day when a young Annie had come to tell a wild animal child turn a wild animal child into a little girl. We remember how she was when Annie first came, don't we? She was not a very good girl, nice girl. That was the most important day of my life, Helen said many times. It was my soul's birthday, the day my teacher came to me, and you're blessed for the teacher that came to you. And now she was gone. A big piece of my heart had just died too, Helen said. How could she go on living without teacher by her side? But there was still so much to do. With the help of a wonderful woman named Polly Thompson, Helen continued to give her lectures. She went all over the United States. More and more often, she went to foreign lands, too. Then in 1939, a terrible war broke out in Europe. It spread to many countries of the world. Soon, the men of the United States, too, were fighting in the Second World War. Many were wounded in the battles. Some were blind and deafened. Others were crippled or lost arms and legs. Often these men did not want to go on living. President Franklin Roosevelt asked Helen Keller to visit them. He wanted her to help them see that life was still worth living. In the next few years, Helen went from hospital to hospital all across the land, and everywhere the men welcomed her. One soldier said, I read about you in school. I never thought I'd be blind myself. Helen didn't try to fool these men with words of every cheer, easiness. Of course, you will have bitter moments, she said. I do too. Of course, there will be days when you will feel restless and lonely and cheated. All I can tell you is live as much like other people as you can. Keep your life full of books and work and friends. I do, and look how well it has worked for me. Helen wasn't busy working. When Helen wasn't busy working, she filled her days with fun. She was always ready to go to new places and try new things. Life is an adventure, Helen Keller said, or it is nothing. She rode in the cab of a train. She visited a coal mine deep in the earth. The Stony tribe of Indians made her a blood sister. She flew in an open aircraft. She loved that. We're riding on the wind, she cried. Picture of an airplane up high in the sky. Helen went on the roughest camping trip. She visited the great cities of the world. She could tell many of these cities apart by their smells. The Italian section of New York smelled of garlic and salami and cheese. Paris smelled of perfume and powder, wine and tobacco. St. Louis smelled of beer. Finally, Helen Keller grew old and frail. She did not travel anymore. She went home to her house in Westport, Connecticut. Her days were quiet now, but she still kept very busy. Helen got up before 5 every morning. First, she made a simple breakfast for herself. Then she went for a walk. Helen would find her way by holding onto wires that stretched all around her land. I cannot see or hear, but I find hundreds of things to interest me, she said. She loved to feel the smooth skin of a silver birch tree or the rough, shaggy bark of a pine. If I'm lucky, she said, I can put my hand on a small tree and feel it quiver as a bird sings in its branches. Helen still worked 6 or 7 hours a day at her desk. In the evening, friends came to call on Helen. Late at night, Helen usually read herself to sleep. Many times, someone would go past her dark room and hear her fingers brushing over raised letters or rows of braille dots. She lived until she was 87 years old. Then, on June 1st, 1968, that's a couple years after I was born, Helen Keller slipped away into the dark silence. Helen Keller was dead, but her spirit lives on. As she said so many times, the best and most beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or even touched. They must be felt with the heart. And that is one of my favorite Helen Keller quotes. So now you know the story of Helen Keller, one of my favorite books. It's very inspiring. So I hope you'll talk to teacher and you will discuss the things that you learned in this book. I hope you will learn that you can do anything because you aren't like Helen. You're not deaf and you're not blind. But even if sometime in life you become deaf or blind, you can still learn, you can still be excited about life. So here's a picture of Helen and Annie Sullivan when she was younger. And then we have a couple more pictures. We have a picture of Helen reading with her fingers. Remember, as she reads the braille with the dots. And the last picture is Helen riding a horse. She loved to ride a horse. And you're like, wow, how did she ride a horse when she was blind? She really wanted to do. She was a very adventuresome young lady. So we can do it too. Open up your world by reading. Have a good day.